Good morning, everybody. Afternoon. We're into the top 10 now, officially. My lovely wife Kathy's here to assist us once again. Those are in the right order, top note. Number 10. Favorite of mine, and possibly number one on my personal list, in terms of how much I listen to, is Hank Mobley. I'm a big Hank Mobley guy. He's in the Coleman, Dexter, Lester, Illinois Jacquet vein, but he comes along a little bit later, which places him firmly in the hard bop era. And for me, he's one of the preeminent guys during the hard bop blue note expressions of the late 1950s. He has a more optimistic, positive outlook on where things are heading in this country. He seems to be a guy that's let's see if we can make some things work and figure some things out here, versus some of the other guys that seem to be a little bit more militant and beyond negotiating or talking anymore. Mobley seems to have a gentle spirit, kindness, a meditative approach, and his playing is very centered, very melodic. He was nicknamed the middleweight champion of jazz because he wasn't soft like Getz, and he wasn't the huge bluster of Coltrane. He was more under control, but he was definitely a strong player with a strong melodic sense, a great composer in the era of the hard bop. He's just a giant. He's born in Eastman, Georgia, July 7, 1930, and then he moves to Elizabeth, New Jersey as a young child. And Elizabeth is in the Newark, north of Newark actually, so it's pretty much New York City, just to the east, the west across the river. He gets his first saxophone as a kid because he was locked in a room for 2 months from an illness. That they didn't specify what it was, but his grandma bought him a sax to help him pass the time. He ends up recovering. He goes to some local bands around the Newark, East, the Jersey area. He goes to some schooling in the Newark area about music, but he realized he didn't have the funding to do the things he wanted to do. So he ends up kind of joining bands. He ends up catching the attention of Dizzy and Max Roach, and he plays with those guys early on. And then he gets noticed by the Jazz Messengers, by the great Arthur Blakey. He's a part of the early Horace Silver, Art Blakey groups. And then when Silver goes his own way, Watkins and Mobley go with Silver. And of course, Mobley goes on his own shortly after that. And he releases one of the greatest strings of albums on Blue Note for 15 years. There's 20 plus records that are just treasured by most jazz collectors today. And you can measure someone's love of jazz by their knowing of Hank Mobley. If they say they love jazz and they don't know Hank Mobley, they're still in the beginning stages. They're still getting to know the music, and that's fine. But if you're sitting on the back of a bus with someone, you start talking jazz, and they throw out, "Oh, I love Hank Mobley," you know they spent some time digging. They've come to some conclusions and learned some things about this music. Mobley's got a genuine nature, a real sincerity. Like you said, he's got the integrity of Coltrane without the bluster. He's more under control and meditative. But it doesn't mean he's not got plenty of fire. He does. He plays that tempo really well. And he's also very much an empath in terms of he takes on the mentality of the leadership of a session. So if he's playing with Freddie Hubbard and Art Blakey, he's going to be very much more aggressive and on the edges than when he's playing with a Kenny Dorham or a Blue Mitchell. You know, it really impacts how he plays. Some of his most fiery stuff is with Lee Morgan, and Lee Morgan has that impact on almost everybody. Sonny Clark is another guy that really brings out edge in a player. And Mobley, like I said, he's a real empath. He really kind of molds his sound and his tone to the session he's recording and who he's recording with. Let's dive into his discography. Early in 1954, maybe 55, he gets this session on his own here at Blue Note. It's a 10-inch, 50-66, right towards the end of the Blue Note 10-inch line. This is a Japanese 12-inch reissue of it, of course. Original 10 inches of this, even beat up, go for hundreds of bucks. And I'm not in the habit of spending hundreds of bucks for beat up records. My wife would leave me if I did, as I said. Even here in this early session with Watkins, Horace Silver, Art Blakey, you can hear who Mobley is and what he's going to become. And it's a great record. He's in Elizabeth, New Jersey, which is as close to Newark as it is to Manhattan. So his first 2 sessions he cuts are at Savoy, 12-0-6-4, 12-0-9-2. And neither of these were really recorded as Hank Mobley sessions, but being the sax player, he kind of ends up getting the credit, and on CD, you'll see these as a Hank Mobley records. But they were kind of just the jazz message of the entire ensemble. And the ensemble was Donald Byrd, Mobley, Horace Silver, Watkins, John Laporta, Ronnie Ball, a Savoy guy, Wendell Marshall, Kenny Clark. The lineup changes a little bit for this one, but these are all great up-and-coming young hard boppers in the New York, New Jersey area, and most of these guys go on to fairly decent careers, starting with Byrd, Mobley, Silver. You know, it's pretty impressive stuff. Hard to come by, and these Savoys can fetch pretty good money. He then goes to Prestige in '57, and he makes Mobley's Message, which is a highly rated record. This is with Byrd, Watkins, McLean, Art Taylor, and Barry Harris on the piano. Then he makes the second Message on Prestige, 70-82 and 70-61. And this is with Walter Bishop, Kenny Dorham, Doug Watkins, and Art Taylor. And then in that same time frame, he manages to put out Tenor Conclave, which is Al Cohn, Hank Mobley, Zoot Sims, and John Coltrane. And at the time of this being recorded, Zoot Sims is probably the biggest name of that bunch. Coltrane's up and coming. Mobley's just kind of arriving. Cohn's kind of known, but he's in the white circle more. And this is just a really cool record, worth checking out. This moves us along to his Blue Note era. 1540, it starts. So we're talking 1958 probably, maybe even 57. But this is with Donald Byrd and Lee Morgan. And this is a tough record to come by. It's the Japanese version of it. You see those 3 young giants with the Alfred Lion photography right there. And these guys are serious. If you take a look at the color of their faces, and I'm not talking their skin color, I'm talking their emotional context. The colors are very intense. They're very serious. This is the prelude to a war. And you can't joke around the prelude to a war. Shortly after, 3 records later, 1544, is Hank Mobley and his All-Stars. Another great record, another one really hard to find. Milt Jackson, Horace Silver are featured on that. And then 1550 is a classic with Art Farmer, Horace Silver, Doug Watkins, and Art Blakey. And Art Farmer is a classic example of a guy when Mobley plays with him. He's creamy, he's delightful, he's soft in his nature. And the difference between Art Farmer, Hank Mobley, and Lee Morgan, Hank Mobley, is pretty stark. This is outstanding stuff, and definitely is a record that's tough to come by. That leads us to 1560, which is probably his first classic record in terms of, like, it's really a maturity has set in. John Jenkins has joined the group. Bobby Timmons of future Jazz Messenger fame is in the group. Wilbur Ware, Philly Joe Jones, great Reed Miles album cover. And then 1568, that's also an incredible record with Bill Hardman, Curtis Porter, Sonny Clark, Paul Chambers, and Art Taylor. So these first 5 in the 1500 series are all pretty outstanding records. This is Peck in Time, Hank Mobley, Lee Morgan, 1574. And there's a run of records at Blue Note from about 1570 to about 1595 that no label anywhere in the history of jazz can rival. They put out 25 records in a row that aren't just jazz canon stuff, they're hierarchy stuff. Just really amazing run by an incredible label. This is the Poppin' Session, one that was sat on by for a long time. The Japanese eventually issued it at some point, but it's from 57 in that same time frame as what we're talking about. Pepper Adams is on this. You don't hear him with Hank Mobley very often. Our Farmer, Sonny Clark, Paul Chambers, and Philly Joe Jones. The Tone Poets finally reissued this with a decent cover this past year. They do a nice job with it. It's only $30. It's a great way to get a great Mobley session for a great price. Now we enter a string of records he does, where he does 3 or 4 records in a row that are just the cream of the crop. Starting with Soul Station 4031. This is truly one of the great jazz, modern, it's somewhat hard bop, but it's also steeped in the blues, and it's got some elements of even soul jazz. It's got real R&B-esque moments. It's an easy, fun listen, and anybody can put on Soul Station and feel it. My wife wouldn't cringe if I played Soul Station in the car. If I played Bitches Brew, I'd probably have to stop the car and let a girl out, or she actually might drop me off on the side of the road and left my Bitches Brew CD with me and put some Hank Mobley on, because she understands if it doesn't hurt, I don't mind it. But if it's going to make my ears hurt, do it on your own time. And I have less and less of my own time for that myself, and I certainly ain't going to push it on my dear wife, who already has to deal with me on a daily basis as it is. I'll keep it to Hank Mobley for my lady friend. Little Big Lebowski, my lady friend. Hank Mobley, Roll Call. And this is a great example of 2 records that come back to back, 4080 and 4058. Puts them both in 1960. And the one record's with Blakey, Freddie Hubbard, Wynton Kelly, and Paul Chambers. The other one is with Grant Green, Wynton Kelly, Paul Chambers, and Philly Joe. By changing out Philly Joe and Grant Green, and here adding in Freddie Hubbard and Art Blakey, you take a guess. Which one's going to be cooler, easier to listen to, softer, breezier, and which one's going to be hotter, more fiery, more intense? Well, you put Hank with Hubbard and Blakey, there's going to be some smoke. And you put him with Grant Green and with Philly Joe, now we're talking about cold smoke. It's just that cool, laid back. This is the 4th record that comes out consecutively there, 4149. No Room for Squares, classic Blue Note album cover. I think it's actually from a couple different sessions, which I was kind of surprised by. But Morgan Bird, Andrew Hill shows up here on some of it, Hancock's on some of it. This is, again, Blue Note lore, as it were. The Turnaround is an outstanding record from probably 1961. Hubbard, Harris, Chambers, and Billy Higgins. And this is brighter, again, with Hubbard being part of the mix. Dippin' is from 59, I don't know, it's actually like 62 probably. Lee Morgan, Harold Mayburn Jr., Ridley, and Billy Higgins. This is also a classic record. Caddy for Daddy. We start to move into the Boogaloo era here. Lee Morgan had his big hit with Sidewinder. And you know, so the whole Boogaloo thing of Blue Note, you kind of need to put a Boogaloo R&B-ish track on there to help us make some records so we can keep doing the other stuff. Caddy for Daddy's great. This record, that 45, sold pretty well. It's successful, and a lot of modern day collectors deem jazz that was successful as, oh, I don't want that. People like that one. I want the stuff no one likes. It's just strange. Slice of the Top is a record that was sat on, didn't get released, came out later, 4241, with James Spaulding, Lee Morgan, Kiyan Zawadi, Howard Jones, McCoy Tyner's on this, Workman, Billy Higgins. High Voltage is 4273, which puts it actually one of the last albums Blue Note puts out before they sell to Liberty. And to me, one of the saddest days in jazz history is when Blue Note finally sold its ownership to the Liberty label, and the label changes. Reed Miles leaves, so the art departments leave. Frank and Albert lose their total control. The sessions change, the rosters change, the production, the direction of what we're trying to achieve here. It becomes, everything just changes pretty overnight. And then United Artists buys out Liberty, and so Blue Note ends up on United Artists for a while. And the best thing about the United Artists Liberty era is those labels had better distribution, and so the most readily available copies of Blue Note stuff is often United Artists and Liberty issues of the classic Blue Note canon. Stuff that was actually released under the Blue Note label is toughest to find. This is a Hank Mobley Reach Out 4288. This comes after the sale. This is one of the first times I heard the great Woody Shaw on trumpet, who's a young kid at this point, and he ends up being one of the fiery trumpet players of the 70s. I've heard him more through streaming and on YouTube. I don't have a lot of Woody Shaw stuff, but he's a up-and-coming giant of the late era when there's not a lot of trumpet players showing up anymore at this point. That's a fun record in Paris. And Hank does spend some time overseas, as most of these black guys do at some point. This is The Flip, an awful cover. It's a decent record. What's that?
I don't know the name.
Faraway Lands is 4425. This is also a session that was recorded earlier and comes out, recorded in 67, then comes out like in 1970. Straight, no filter is also one of those sessions. There's a lot of Mobley stuff that kind of sits in the vaults because he recorded a lot. This is Thinking of Home again with Woody Shaw from probably 1969 area. And then he does these two records on Roulette. And these aren't studio sessions. This is live stuff from Birdland, the club, that somehow Roulette got the ownership to. And it's got Billy Root, Curtis Fuller, Lee Morgan, Hank Mobley, plus the rhythm section. These are pretty incredible records. And Billy Root is a guy who's a great sax player that didn't make my 50 greatest white sax player list because he shows up on a lot of great records, but he doesn't get really anything as a leader that I know of. So these are fun records. Again, they're live. They're not the best sounding recordings, but they still document some real giants on their path. And he ends up working with Cedar Walton in a group. This is on Cobblestone in the early 70s. Sam Jones, Billy Higgins, and Charles Davis. Great record. Cedar Walton's a very progressive player. Plays, of course, with the Jazz Messengers at a point. Great stuff. Mobley is just an icon, and I'm a huge fan. That's going to move us on to number 9. And number 9 on my list now is the great Illinois Jacquet. And you might say Illinois Jacquet made your top 10, and he does. He does. And me and my friend Jean-Michel talked about it numerous times, how he's one of the most underappreciated guys in jazz. His sound embodies a lot of what the tenor is about. And if there's a missing link in jazz between Coleman Hawkins and Dexter Gordon, Sonny Rollins, it's Illinois Jacquet. He's like the real co-founder of the Texas tenor sound. He's got that big tone, drenched in the blues, drenched in the rhythms of R&B. Illinois Jacquet is barbecue sauce all day long. He ends up working at Norgran with Norman Granz. He does this cool record here that gets issued on Clef, number C129. It's a cool little 10-inch. There's a picture of the young Texas tenorman. I believe he was born as a black Creole in Louisiana. They moved to Houston, Texas as a young kid. He plays the bassoon as a young kid as well as the saxophone. And yeah, they were Creoles of color, his parents, which is the mix of, Louisiana Cajun with African American. And so it makes him light skinned, which probably opened a few doors for him, but probably closed a few other doors as well. Illinois Jacquet, October 30th, 1922. He's playing in LA in 39. He's playing with Nat King Cole. He sits in with the trio once in a while. He ends up joining Lionel Hampton's group. Lionel Hampton, once again, Hampton convinces him to switch to the tenor, and that was kind of all it wrote. It changed his trajectory completely. On the great song Flying Home, is it? Where'd it go? Flying Home. It's a standard of the Hampton Orchestra. Hampton is kind of interloping in between the vibes of Lionel Hampton, and he ends up kind of building the crowd into a frenzy, and it became a centerpiece of the Lionel Hampton Orchestra show. And he actually said it was exhausting every night, knowing that you were the linchpin that had to get the crowd excited and moving and going. And night after night, he brought the house down playing the song Flying Home. He ends up leaving the group. Arnett Cobb ends up taking his place playing the same song. And then actually Dexter Gordon takes his place playing the same song. Flying Home was a real standard for anybody playing with Lionel Hampton, and it was a tenorman's dream in a way to learn how to play that song. 44 in LA, he works with Mingus a little bit when they're both kind of young fellas. He ends up replacing Lester Young in Count Basie's group, and that's some big shoes to fill. He goes to Europe for a lot of the 60s and the 70s. He's arrested a few times. He's an activist for race equality in the Jim Crow South. And he convinces Norman Granz to bring the Jazz Philharmonic down to Houston. They don't tell anybody when they book the hotel there's going to be blacks. They end up trying to get kicked out of the hotel. And they end up having the police called on them. The cops come and arrest Dizzy Gillespie, Ella Fitzgerald, Illinois Jacquet, and one of their assistants. And they end up taking them down to the prison, taking photographs of them. They paid their fines, and actually they made it back to the venue for the second set. Whether it was just publicity, trying to show we weren't going to tolerate integration, or whether it was even a certain amount of those are some really talented black guys, we'd like to meet them. It almost reads both ways when I was researching that. But throughout that era, he's really kind of being a champion with Norman Granz for equality and the integration of the Musicians Guild, and the opportunities that were there for black musicians were so less than what was there for the white guys. The white guys were making a killing financially off this black music, and black guys were having a tough time paying their bills. It had to sting sometimes. This is a great session recorded in '59 for the Roulette label. Illinois Jacquet Flies Again, which is of course a reference to Flying Home. This is a great place to start with Illinois. It's a great swinging, hard driving session. He records this on Epic in '62. It's also a really great record. You don't see it as often as you think you would be. It's on Epic. And then he moves to Argo. And then I'm missing some of his stuff. He did a lot of stuff with Clef that's hard to find and rather expensive. And I'm going to try to pick some of that stuff up in the coming years, but I haven't got to it yet. He goes to Argo in probably 1962. And he makes a string of records there that are awesome. They're blues drenched. They got the sound of Chicago. He uses a lot of Chicago guys on some of these records, but guys like Kenny Burrell, who was actually on Argo for a while, Wallace Richardson, William Rodriguez, Ben Tucker, some great players were on these records. Van Gelder is actually recorded at Van Gelder Studio in New Jersey. But The Message with Kenny Burrell, outstanding. With Kenny Burrell, Desert Winds, outstanding. Illinois Jacquet and strings play Cole Porter. Spectrum, 754, 773, Go Power. Illinois Jacquet with Milt Buckner and Alan Dawson. And then he moves to Prestige and has a little bit of a comeback resurgence there, doing kind of soul bluesy stuff still. 75, 75, 75, 97. These are great solid Jacquet records as well, worthy of having. And then these are from his time in Europe on the Black Lion label. This is with Wild Bill Davis, and this is Genius at Work. And you can really hear his maturity on these records. And he's just a giant. And I wish I had more of his discography, and I wish I had more Illinois Jacquet to show you. Like I said, it's become really tough to come by. And he's from that in-between era, like Dexter Gordon, where we're going from the 78 to the 10-inch to the LP. And it just kind of convolutes the discographies of some of those musicians, makes some of their work really hard to find. Some of it gets called on the LP immediately. Some of it doesn't come out on LP till the 60s, 70s. So you never really know where to find some of that era by these guys. Next guy we're going to talk about, number 8, Mr. Wayne Shorter. And Wayne Shorter is truly one of the great giants of this music that's still alive. Wayne's still with him, and he's still making music, impressively enough. Wayne comes to us via the Jazz Messengers through Lee Morgan while Lee was assigned to VJ. He ends up joining the Jazz Messengers and has a huge impact on the Blakey groups. He's born August 25, 1933 in Newark, which again is in New Jersey. He's a music student. He tries to go to the Newark Arts High School, and he learns some stuff there. He's influenced a lot by Hawkins, Rollins, and Coltrane. Again, he's a jazz messenger by 58, 59, and he ends up becoming the director of the band and having a real influence on the arc of the jazz messengers at that time. And he plays with the Blakey group, a muscular, bright, hard-driving jazz messenger style. He ends up joining Miles in '64 for the next 5 years for the great Second Miles Quintet, and he gets to kind of branch out. There's more of an emotional complexity to Wayne Shorter in the Miles group than there is with the Art Blakey stuff. But with Blakey, he's blustery and muscular and intense, and with Miles, there's more variation to how Wayne can sound. But he ends up becoming the main composer for Miles group as well. I'm not going to go too deep on Wayne Shorter, in part because I'm going to do an episode on him sometime in the near future. He's just such a giant. My discography of him is mostly his 60s work. I might have one or two of his 70s records. I do have most of his side work, but his first two records as a leader are on the VJ label out of Indiana, right next to Chicago. Waning Moments and Introducing Wayne Shorter, 2006 through 2029. These are outstanding sessions. You hear the young man developing. I think Lee Morgan's on one of them, if I recall. Yeah, Lee Morgan, Wynton Kelly, Paul Chambers, Jimmy Cobb. Not a bad lineup for your first record. And on the second one, I don't think Morgan's on this one. It's Freddie Hubbard, Eddie Higgins, Marshall Thompson, and Jamie Merritt. So you got a couple of messengers there with Merritt and Hubbard. I forgot Hubbard was on this. Every time I find a Freddie Hubbard record, I want to go back and listen to it again. So he goes to Blue Note, and while he's with the Messengers and while he's with Miles, he's recording some landmark records at Blue Note. Lee Morgan, Reggie Workman, Elvin Jones. This is Night Dreamer, who we're listening to. Beautiful, complex, modern. Morgan's got his bright, brittle, edgy self. Shorter's kind of the anchor holding it together. 4182 is Juju, another great Wayne Shorter record. And these are almost all his compositions. Just like most of the Blakey stuff I had was his compositions. Just like most of the stuff in Miles was his compositions. Wayne Shorter's songbook is really huge. This is Speak No Evil, 4194. Another outstanding record with Hubbard, Hancock, Carter, and Elvin Jones. Then we move on to The All-Seeing Eye, 4219. This is with Al Shorter, Grasham Moncour, Freddie Hubbard, James Spaulding, Herbie Hancock, Ron Carter, and Joe Chambers. That's quite a group he's got there. Some pretty complex arrangements. He has some Ellington in him, where he likes to use dual dissonance, resolve it, have contrasting movements that are kind of offsetting and coloring each other. This is Adam's Apple with Hancock, Workman, and Chambers, 4232, about 1965. This is Supernova. This comes after The Sale, 1969. There's a bit of a gap there, but he's also working a lot with Miles at that point. Supernova's a great record. John McLaughlin's on this, Sonny Chirac, Walter Booker, Miroslav Vitruvis, Jack DeJohnette, Chick Corea, Ayrton Moriera, Maria Booker. Pretty incredible lineup. My least favorite Blue Note album cover of all time, and it's not close, is this Moto Grosso Feo with Chick Corea, John McLaughlin, Ron Carter, Dave Holland, and Michelin Prell. It's from 1970-71, I recall. So it's well after The Sale, actually 74 maybe. It's well after The Sale of Blue Note, and shows you how awful the art department became at Blue Note. This looks like a cheap budget label put it out. And the stuff with Reed Miles under their own steam is some of the greatest album covers ever. This is the Soothsayer record, a section that was sat on from about 65. Spaulding, Hubbard, McCoy Tyner, Ron Carter, and Tony Williams. This is a tone poet that came out last year, etc. Another great session with Shorter, Hancock's Cecil McBee and Joe Chambers. This is a great session. I was really impressed by it. And then this comes out on Columbia, Native Dancer 75, and this is a different era of Wayne Shorter for sure. So that's Wayne Shorter. Again, we'll probably do an episode on him before too long. I just feel like he's such an integral part of the modern sound and look of jazz. So that leads us to our next guy here, number 7, the great Ben Webster. And Ben Webster is probably the guy I have the least records by that I should have more by. And oddly, his stuff's kind of hard to come by. His Verve clef stuff is not that available to find. Here in the Midwest, you don't really see it at all. It's more probably on the East Coast. I've been looking for some Webster stuff. I definitely need to find some more, but it's tough to find. Webster is in the direct descendancy of Coleman Hawkins. And Coleman Hawkins is the guy who really brings the saxophone to the fore and makes it the instrument that it becomes, to the point of when most people think of jazz, saxophone's what they think of. And the great Coleman Hawkins is all the reasons for that. Coleman was a dynamic soloist, always a great storyteller, and speaking of storytelling, listen to my brother's tone. Ooh, it's airy, it's breathy, it's almost sleepy. Almost sleepy. Sleepy? Melancholy. Webster is a kind of interesting character. He's a playful cat. There's Bean Hawkins and there's Ben. These two giants, this record on Verve is outstanding, 8327 from about 1957. And it puts the two giants together. And you can't really talk about Hawkins without knowing Webster's right on his tail. And his, I don't even want to call him his protege. They were kind of contemporaries. Webster plays with Basie. He plays with Ellington for a while. There's a story that he either punched Ellington or slapped Ellington and cut one of his suits because they had a debate. And Ellington wasn't without being a fiery guy at times. And his musicians loved him, but also were driven crazy by him at times. He's born March 27, 09 in Kansas City, which is also the same area where Coleman Hawkins is from. So they're both centered around that KC blues, the swing era of the 30s. Kansas City's a rough and tumble town at that point, and Webster and Hawkins embody all those characteristics. Surrounded by vice, surrounded by drugs, surrounded by money, because there was a lot of corruption in Kansas City. And so all the great guys were going to KC, all the great swing bands. Parker was there, Lester Young was there. It's a pretty intense scene in KC in the late 30s. He learns to play the blues from Pete Johnson. He ends up playing with groups of Benny Moten, Benny Carter, plays with the great Fletcher Henderson, just like Coleman Hawkins did. He plays with Cab Calloway. In the 40s, he plays with Ellington. His Cottontail's one of his great renowned pieces with Ellington. They had that altercation. He steps aside from Ellington's group. He does come back in 47 for a while from what I read. He ends up working with Norman Granz quite a lot, like I said. And Oscar Peterson ends up backing it up on the Oscar Peterson trio. He worked a lot with Sweets Edison. Some of my Sweets Edison records have Ben Webster as a sideman. I got a lot of Webster as a sideman. He's everywhere. But as a leader, he doesn't get nearly as much. And I don't have enough of it. He ends up in the late 50s working at a club in LA with Jerry Mulligan. It leads to him making a record with Jimmy Witherspoon here. This is Mulligan and Webster at the Renaissance Club with Mel Lewis on drums, Leroy Vinegar and Jimmy Rawls. Witherspoon's one of the great jazz blues singers of this era. A great West Coast guy. It's on the Hi-Fi label, which has a cool logo on the center. But this is actually an original Hi-Fi label plastic sleeve. You don't see that very often. That's pretty cool. I just actually found this record the other day, and it's pretty exciting to have an original Hi-Fi record with its original sleeve in there. This is Ben Webster 8318 and Associates, again on the Norman Granz label. It's got Coleman Hawkins on it again, Bud Johnson, another Texas Tenorman's on this, Roy Eldridge is on a trumpet, Jimmy Jones, Leslie Spann, and Papa Joe Jones, and Ray Brown is on the bass. Talking about a record full of giants. no one can really match Verve in the late 50s for how they could stock a record. It's unprecedented what they're capable of. This is Ben Webster meets Oscar Peterson from about 1957 as well. Peterson Group is backing him. It's great stuff. Peterson is one of the great players when it comes to backing up other leaders. You know, Peterson's your perfect guy with Ray Brown and Ray Ellis to just back up your sound. One of his most famous sessions is, of course, the Soulville record. Soulville comes out probably 1958, no, 56, 57, 82, 74. The Verve discography, absolutely a beautiful record. And like this, you can just really hear the sound and the tone that dominates what Ben Webster's about. And if you're Dexter Gordon, if you're John Coltrane playing a ballad, Sonny Rollins playing a ballad, Ben Webster's in your sound. That's the thing about jazz. Coleman Hawkins and Ben Webster are in almost every player. What the fuck is that? People drive go-karts and golf carts and lawnmowers to get a drink in this fucking town.
That was a little tractor.
The number of sounds and disturbances we've had over the last 2 years making these videos is insane. It's noisier here than the city. I was in the heart of the big city for 30 years, in a small town for 1 year, and these small towns are loud. This is a session that comes out on Riverside with Ben Webster and the great Austrian Joe Zawinul. Again, Webster is playful, melodic, centered best. And all the great tenor players have Webster and Coleman Hawkins in them. And this is, you see at the fair, even Impulse knew that it was important to have Ben Webster. And so they issued this session pretty early in the Impulse, 865. And again, Impulse wasn't just about Coltrane, Eiler, and Shep. They wanted to sell records, and they were doing it with stuff like this. And that wraps up my discography of the great Ben Webster. And he deserves his spot here at number 7. He's absolutely one of the true giants of this music, and is very underappreciated by the modern day collector. And that's going to push us on to number 6, LTD, Long Tall Dexter. And Dexter Gordon at number 6, he, along with Hank Mobley, has become my 2 favorite players of this music, especially on the saxophone. I am a huge fan of the great Dexter Gordon. Dexter has a troubled life, as a lot of these guys do. Drug problems, prison sentences. He's in that same era as Illinois Jacquet, where stuff's kind of bridging the different formats from 10 inches to the 78s to the 10 inches to the LPs. So it makes collecting them kind of convoluted. Guys didn't get album sessions like they did in the LP era back in the 40s. You cut a couple tracks, you know, and who's going to get leadership wasn't even always guaranteed in those days. Bebop, he was central to that whole movement, an LA West Coast guy. He's born February 27, 1923. He's 6'6", so he's a tall drink of water. He was tan, debonair, well-dressed, had a great drug connection. The girls flocked around him. He was also known as a sophisticated giant. He just is a real character of black personality in America. You know, I feel like I knew a dozen Dexter Gordons in my ears DJing soul music. These guys would come in and they just had that quiet confidence, reserved nature. You knew they had what it took, but they weren't boastful. They were just kind of doing their thing. I learned to love a lot of their humility, you know. In the face of great adversary, sometimes it's where you learn humility and grace. And these guys exude that. Dexter, to me, is all about grace and humility, and there's a struggle and a sorrow, but he's also got kind of a cheeky optimism at times that kind of balances him out pretty well. He's always a fun listen. His Blue Note stuff, which I'll show you in a second, is absolutely legendary. As is this session right here, but he's got a large, full sound. It's kind of spacious. Are you fucking kidding me? This asshole just went to the store, got himself a pack of cigarettes on a little mini tractor, and now he's going by again at 6 miles a fucking hour. I want to shoot with a BB gun. Unbelievable. I wish I could show you. I call that clown shoes, and you should never go out in clown shoes. Who cruises Main Street on a Sunday morning in a little mini tractor? He's very influenced by Lester Young, sorry. Lester was, of course, an influence on everybody. So it puts him in the Hawkins, Ben Webster, Lester Young school. But he came into the bebop sound and really became one of the innovators, battling on Central Avenue with Wardell Gray, making some legendary sessions that obviously weren't issued at the time, but have become since collectors' landmarks. He works for a time with Chico Hamilton and Buddy Collette. I think they actually went to school together. His dad was one of the first black doctors in Los Angeles. And so he has somewhat of a middle class background. But he plays with Lionel Hampton, 40 to 43. Again, there's that Lionel Hampton. Plays with Billy Eckstine, the guy who's also always present. In 45, he starts doing some recording with Savoy out on the East Coast. And those Savoy recordings are called on an LP called Dexter Rides Again. Great stuff. He comes back to the West Coast in 46. He's working with Wardell Gray doing The Hunt. 53 to 55, he's in The Joint. He comes out, works with Stan Levy at Bethlehem. He makes a couple of great records in 55 on Bethlehem and on this Dutone label, which we're listening to right now. Ends up going back to prison for another 5 years in Folsom. Gets out in 59. Records a record with Jazzland that's kind of his comeback. Then he moves to Blue Note in 61. And boy, let me tell you, he can cry you a river at that point. So let's kind of look through his discography here. These are early Regent Savoy recordings from an Army base. I think back in 49 with Wardell, Sonny Chris, Hampton Hawes, Barney Kessel, Howard McGee, Al Killian. It's a pretty serious group. I think they're playing, it's just a concert on the West Coast. But these guys are all the up-and-coming guys happening on the West Coast. This is that stuff from 45 I told you about that comes out on LP in about 1960 on Savoy. And it's from a couple different sessions with Blakey, Powell, Roach, Tad Dameron, Curly Russell. There's some pretty serious talent on those sessions as well. That leads us to his two records in 55 that are great places to start with Dexter Gordon. This is on the Dutone label, and this is on the Bethlehem label. Bethlehem's an East Coast label like Gus Wilde. They start looking for West Coast talent. He was without a contract, so they record this great Dexter record. He gets arrested, comes back in 60, makes this record for Jazzland, which is Riverside, and he's shaking the rust off here a little bit. Then he moves to Blue Note. And 4077, Doing All Right, with George Tucker, Al Harewood, and Horace Parlin, and the young Freddie Hubbard. 4083 with Kenny Drew, Paul Chambers, and Philly Joe Jones. Dexter Gordon, Go, with Sonny Clark, Butch Warren, and Billy Higgins. A lot of these are going to be in quartets, because you don't need any other horn players to fill up the space when you're talking about Dexter Gordon. Sonny Clark, Butch Warren, Billy Higgins again. 4133, A Swinging Affair. Our Man in Paris, actually recorded in Paris. He goes to Paris for a long time. He stays over there for 14 years. And a lot of these American players became legends in Europe and slipped into obscurity in America. Americans didn't follow guys. They didn't follow black musicians as much as it was, especially not once they went to Europe. One Flight Up is great. The song Tanya is absolutely outstanding. Donald Byrd brings a little extra fire to this session. Really fantastic. Getting Around 4204 with Hutcherson, Harris, Cranshaw, and Higgins. Another great album cover. This is the Clubhouse session, which doesn't get issued right away. It comes out later. And then this is Dexter Gordon Quartet, Bouncing with Dex. It's from the 70s. I think it's right around the time. No, it's before he comes back. He was from Europe. It's with Niels Henning, Offset Peterson, Tete Monteleo, Dexter Gordon, and Billy Higgins, recorded in 1975. Now this is the Homecoming record. He comes back to New York. and he's a smash success on his return. And that didn't happen for Lucky Thompson. It didn't happen for a lot of the guys when they came back. Illinois Jacquet, Don Bias, those guys came back and no one gave a shit. Dexter Gordon came back and the timing was just so that jazz had lost its audience. The fusion, the free, the avant-garde had driven everybody away. And Dexter comes back playing traditional jazz, and people flocked to hear it. And it was such a wonderful renaissance, and gives jazz another kind of secondary life in the 80s there for a little bit. This is some Blue Note stuff, the collection pulled together. And this is the great Chase record, The Hunt, sorry, from LA in 47. Some of it was recorded on Savoy. That's Wardell Gray and Dexter Gordon battling, 2 LPs worth of it. Outstanding. Saxophone battle galore stuff. Killer stuff. So thank you to my lovely wife for helping us do this countdown. We're up to number 6 now. We got 5 more to go. We're going to do those for you in the next couple of days. Say thanks, wife. Love you, baby. It's been lovely having you aboard for this. It was just easier having her hand me all these records. It would have been a lot of me shuffling about trying to get all this stuff to show to you guys. So that's the 10 through 6. And that's some pretty hallowed ground right there. We got 5 more to go. If you can't guess those top 5, maybe you should listen to The Clash. Peace.